Okay, we're going to reconvene now and get started on page 18, which is our next topic, and I'm going to turn this over to Tony Scott, our government CIO, to kick it off. Tony?
All right, thanks, Dave. So for the next bit, we're going to spend a little time on FITARA, which is the Federal IT Acquisition Reform Act. That was, you can see on page 20, is kind of a timeline of the act. It was created in December of 2014, and almost immediately we began figuring out a plan about how we would go address this particular law. It basically is a law that goes further than what Clinger-Cohen did a decade or so ago, and creates specific IT authorities, CIO authorities in the agency, and calls upon the CIOs to be responsible for a set of activities, which we'll talk about in a minute. We decided to take a very open and public approach to this law and created a number of working groups among internal to government people, as well as we got a tremendous amount of input and support from the community at large. Organizations like ACT-IACT and others were very, very involved with us in that. In April, at the end of April, we released our draft guidance for public comment, created a GitHub site for this, and also then got additional input on this that was frankly, I think, very, very helpful and really pointed out to us areas that needed more clarification or explanation, areas that might have been confusing, a whole bunch of good things like that. In June, we actually released our FITARA guidance, and then in August 15th, the agencies were supposed to submit their self-assessment of how they were going to go implement FITARA, as well as their, well, a self-assessment of where they were related to what FITARA called for, and then a plan for implementation. We've been reviewing those plans, and we've given the feedback directly back to most agencies now. And the next deadline is December 31st. All agencies will be required to have then implemented their plan. And then next April, they'll do a self-assessment of how they're doing on the plan. And naturally, this will be a topic that we'll talk about as we do portfolio stat sessions and other review sessions with each agency. There's a couple of unique things about this that I would just call to your attention. As I mentioned, this went way beyond where Clinger-Cohen did a few years ago. One of the criticisms of Clinger-Cohen is both authors left Congress right after the law passed, and so there was kind of a dying flame of interest on the part of the sponsors. That's not true of the sponsors of this bill. Congressman Connolly and Congressman Issa are around and looks like likely to stay for a while, and both have told us that they are going to make sure this gets done and done well, which is great. But there's also broader support in Congress. As I've gone up to testify, it's quite clear that Congress is now quite interested in this topic of how IT is run in the federal government, and wants, you know, CIOs to be accountable and responsible for that. There's a couple other things that I would just describe to you in broad terms that are not FITARA direct, but directly named, but are other things that we're doing that this that FITARA is useful for in the context of. So we just put out our update to a circular that's called A130, which is the general guidance of how IT should be run in the federal government. It's out for public comment right now as well. Just like we did with the FITARA thing, we're getting a lot of good comments back on that. This is the first time that document has been updated in more than 10 years as well. So within that document, there's a lot of FITARA pointers and guidance, and these two will go hand in glove in terms of guidance to agencies. We also regularly update our FISMA guidance, which is specific around security and some of those kinds of things. And again, that all points back to FITARA and to A130 as well in some useful ways. So we're trying to make sure that all of these things work well together, refer to one another where appropriate, and emphasize consistent themes throughout. So that's kind of a broad overview of FITARA. I'll turn it over to Bill and Melissa, who are the team that works on this every day, among other things. So, Bill.
Great, thanks, Tony. And we appreciate the panel's time. We're really interested in hearing what you have to say as we go through this. Just, I'll take a step back on a few things here. FITARA really gets to the heart of what's that role of technology in the CIO in federal government. Little history, Tony mentioned Clinger-Cohen. The Clinger-Cohen Act of 1996 really kind of laid out the framework for CIOs in federal government. Been reshaped by a couple of things. One is the Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002. It's also known as the eGov Act, which really gave rise to the federal CIO and again reshaped, and then FITARA again in 2014. But what I do want to point out is this is not about compliance with the law. If we treat this as a compliance with the law, I think that we've really missed that opportunity to do some meaningful change in the way in which we manage and invest in technology in the federal government. So our framing here is that we're really taking a look at this to implant good business practices into the federal government and to frame out why that's so important. For the 24 Chief Financial Officer Act agencies, each year we spend more than $80 billion in technology. Some 70% of that, or some nearly $60 billion, is devoted to keeping the lights on, maintaining what we have. And the danger is, as CIO colleagues around the table will tell you, is that if that's not managed very carefully, that will continue to grow and it will absorb everything. And it's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword in the sense that it continues to create more risk the more and more it takes to manage that, but it also cuts you off from opportunities in terms of being able to extend and improve upon your mission areas as well. So for us, we really need to make sure that what we do here is targeted towards extending how we're able to carry out our missions jointly, but also manage the risks that are inherent there. The reality is that we're heavily reliant upon IT in all aspects of what we do, and we have to find those ways in which to increase our capabilities and to decrease the cost by which we do that. And so this legislation, we really see this as a tool that allows us to create that strategic alignment. And so there are some questions on page 19 that we'll put out up front, and then my colleague Melissa will go through a little bit more information, but we'd love to be able to get to those questions and hear from both the panel and the agencies as soon as possible. That first one really is, how do you incorporate corporate leadership with the leadership of components, business units to jointly drive outcomes? And why I want to point this one out in particular is that we're like a massive conglomerate in government. We have a lot of separate operating units that are out there. However, there's many of these operating units that actually share or have overlapping mission areas. They're not competitors with each other. They're really overlapping in some mission areas. And so what we have to figure out is how we reduce duplication, how we reduce costs that need to be reduced. And again, those incentives for why and how we do that is not the same for the corporate world, but we're looking for your input and advice and guidance on those things. How does corporate leadership work together to align IT resources? How do you manage IT investment from that enterprise corporate level? And how do you balance that need for corporate-wide solutions as opposed to what's needed in those separate mission areas? And then finally, what effective governance practices have you adopted to drive implementation of new, broader company policy? So again, the business drivers for us in government are slightly different. But as we mentioned, as we talked about earlier in the earlier session, is that how do you really create those incentives? And again, I think there's going to be some good comments from the folks here in government. Melissa?
Hey, Bill, could I just jump in and make a point? I think, we have Commerce, we have DHS here, and I'll use just them as examples of when we think about the federal government, we think about the complexity of each of these cabinet level departments. But when you think about DHS, you think about Commerce, and then you sort of look that level below, and you think about the bureaus and the very different missions that, take place within those particular departments, you almost start to think about some of this as more like a holding company. And I think if you think about some of the challenges of a holding company, that's some of the challenges that Steve and others face.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just add a couple more kind of points for context, and then love to open it up for kind of feedback and answering the questions that Bill outlined. So I just wanted to go over real briefly sort of the backbone of our implementation guidance. Tony mentioned in June we released a memo, and really at the core of that was something that we called the common baseline. When Bill talked about how we don't want this to be about compliance and, of course, the complexity and the differences in the federal agencies, we try to give some guidance that helped agencies implement it while also offering kind of flexibility. So the common baseline was our way of doing that, where we outlined about 17 different areas of responsibility in the areas of budget formulation and planning, acquisition, as well as organization and workforce. And under those areas, the outlined responsibilities also talk to the CIOs as well as other agency officials. So the acquisition officials, the human capital officials, budget officers, and financial officers in each agency, because we recognized early on from our outreach that we did that this was really a cross-management issue and priority, and actually implementing it took more than just the CIO doing things. So that's a common baseline in a nutshell, and the implementation plans that Tony also mentioned were focused on how agencies were implementing the common baseline. So while FITARA talks about more than the CIO kind of authorities area, we're really focused on the common baseline, implementing that, and changing how agencies operate while they're buying and managing IT. So I just wanted to mention that for some kind of background and context. If on page 21, it also goes into kind of how these common baseline solutions are addressing specific concerns in the agencies, but I won't go over that word by word. And then briefly, what we're doing kind of right now to implement FITARA. We did a couple things during our outreach that worked really well, and then we wanted to continue fostering the government-wide community. There's a couple existing things in government, the open data policy that had some really great cross-government collaboration and platforms to share knowledge over time. So we adopted some of the great things that they did in that policy area and took it to FITARA. So one of the things we did was start a government-wide listserv, which is open to anyone in the government to join, including contractors. And then we also started bi-weekly meetings. These were started in July, and they're every 2 weeks at GSA, which is really just to facilitate government sharing and collaboration. We don't want this to be FITARA focused, so it's sort of how you're implementing FITARA and changing your management practices. What obstacles are you going into? How can we facilitate sharing of best practices? And then we're also launching an updated site, management.cio.gov, which will be public and sharing best practices, resources, guidelines, anything that we can do to help agencies as they're implementing this and keep it transparent and robust and foster collaboration community. I think that's potentially all I'll mention now, unless anyone mentions anything about the plans, but I would just love to open it up to kind of discussion about this, and of course if you have any questions on specifics of the law.
So just a quick note around the plans. Again, Tony mentioned that we required agencies to submit their plans by August 15th. Again, what we were really looking to do is against a common baseline, which is in many ways like a maturity model, be able to say, how are you performing against these different capability areas? All the agencies submitted those. There was really a lot of good participation and collaboration with the agencies. And so from that standpoint, I think we have a coalition of the willing for kind of moving in this broader-based government approach towards FITARA implementation. Tony mentioned also that date by December 31st. So agencies are now resubmitting those draft implementation plans. And we expect to really get everyone to the point where they've approved those. And what we're looking to do is, again, bake this or weave this into the way that agencies really do business, the business of IT. And so, go ahead.
Maybe my colleagues on the PMAB know a lot more details about FITARA than I do, but can you just go a little deeper into what you're expecting on December 31st? What is that baseline plan supposed to, can you just kind of outline the pillars of the plan? Is that okay? Because I apologize, I'm not as close to it.
No, why are you not so familiar with FITARA? No, I totally understand that. So the implementation plans are focused on the common baseline, and I'll just kind of outline a couple of the things that that means. So we try to have that touch a couple areas of responsibility, including visibility, planning, governance, program collaboration, and certifications and approvals. Because we kind of saw those as overlapping responsibilities of the management shop. And then sort of the specific guidelines got into budget formulation. So for example, when an agency is formulating your budget, how is your CIO involved in that process? Some agencies were farther along than others, and they have different processes for developing that. So it was just the CIO needs to have visibility of IT. How do you define IT resources separate from other resources? And kind of working with the budget office in the agency to define that new process.
And just to interject a question, so did that mandate, I guess I'd call it mandate, not exist before FITARA and now does? Or?
So the specific law was the CIO must approve the IT budget request. A lot of agencies didn't have what we would call an IT budget request. I don't know, you have something like that?
So many would argue that Klinger-Cohen already gave that authority and that accountability to the CIO. As Tony mentioned earlier, this went into a lot more specificity in and around those sorts of authorities and responsibilities and outlined some very specific sorts of things, such as certification statements and budget submissions that say that the CIO and the CFO were actively involved in the formulation of that budget. In the earlier session when we talked about benchmarking, one of the benchmarks that Mr. Salem mentioned was that part about increasing the percentage of that spend that was under management. So this is a good corollary to that. It was really looking to say, you know, how do we ensure that out of that 80 billion plus growing amount of dollars that we really do have an accountable official. So again, a lot would argue that Klinger-Cohen covered that, but this gave a lot more specificity for agencies to follow.
One of the additional areas, Enrique, was in hiring authorities as well. So in many cases, you had CIOs who weren't even in the interview loop for agency CIOs below them in various places. So this calls out specific things in that space as well.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
And so that one of the things that we'd like to do is, again, we have a number of our colleagues here who've been actively involved in the implementation of FITARA, and we'd love to hear any feedback that you all may have. If there are any questions or any items of feedback that you have as it relates to FITARA implementation and challenges that we may face as we go forward.
I wanted to make one additional comment before. Some of you may have seen the scorecard that the House Oversight Government Reform Committee rolled out last week, just concurrent with my showing up there to testimony and to testify. And they gave a lot of agencies D's and F's and all that kind of stuff, and they called it a FITARA scorecard. Though I think the proper way to think about this was actually a pre-FITARA scorecard or a FITARA baseline or something like that, because in all cases, all of the measurements that were done, and we can argue about whether they're right measurements or not, but we're all rear-facing before FITARA actually was implemented or is being implemented. So none of the data that was the subject of that scorecard was after FITARA law was passed. So we look to see, you know, we'll reform the scorecard with some help from our friends at GAO and other places. But I would expect to see significant progress on those metrics and move off of the D's and F's that we saw there.
Can I ask and there'll be a reason for the question to try to get my head around a little bit of this. So can somebody just walk me through the structure of an agency and the group CIO and then the bureau CIO? How does it, can you just walk me through how the organizational structure works inside of an agency just real quickly?
Yeah,
Steve, if you don't mind,
if
Commerce.
it might help, I'll use Commerce as an example. We have 12 bureaus. Our internal components, like Treasury, are referred to as bureaus. Of those 12, 9 have titled CIOs. The missing 3, basically my office, the Department of Commerce CIO office, serves as the equivalent of a bureau CIO. The reporting relationship, I have 25% of each of the bureaus titled CIO's performance evaluation or performance plan on an annual basis. And that 25% inside Commerce is adjusted around what we call critical elements of the performance evaluation plan. So all 25% happen to be focused essentially on business results, which I happen to concur with coming out of the private sector. I think it's the right place to focus. We have 2 levels of governance around IT in the Department of Commerce. I rechartered a Commerce CIO Council, and that's comprised of all of the CIOs and their deputies. And then from time to time, we will have the Chief Information Security Officers and the security officers, if not titled CISO, also involved in significant conversations these days around cyber, that type of thing. The second is through our Commerce-wide Department Management Council. That's the second highest governance body in the department. The CIO is a member of that, as are all the CXOs. Anything that moves from the CIO Council around IT governance, IT decision-making, I typically will take to that Department Management Council. Now, separately, I also report to the Deputy Secretary, administratively. And I'm the only CXO who sits outside the department's Assistant Secretary for Management. That existed before I came into the Department of Commerce about 15 months ago.
Steve, could you also touch on, because I think, Enrique, there's another element that's really unique to this holding company model. Sort of an aside, one night Beth and I were talking, I said, well, it's like a holding company. She goes, yeah, some of this is more like a private equity firm, which was like, well, you know, so
That side of the table.
So I think what's important is, and we stick with Commerce, is how those 13 bureaus actually get funded, because I think therein lies part of the challenge.
Yeah, and the one thing I don't disagree at all with Dave's comment that you could think of us as a holding company in Commerce. We refer to ourselves as a federated model, which is a little bit different, but you'll see why in this response around budget. Every one of our bureaus are funded basically through our appropriations bill from Congress, and they're funded separately. I don't have any real direct control over any of the bureau's IT investments. I have veto authority. I can stop something from occurring if it doesn't meet our agreed either federal guidelines coming out of Tony's office or Commerce CIO guidelines that we've established inside the department.
Very helpful. And the reason I wanted to kind of go there first was, having worked with lots of very large Global 2000 companies, they actually have some similarities to what you just described. And what we found is they have business unit CIOs, and then they have group CIOs, and the group CIOs really are working on the cross-bureau or cross-line of business initiatives. They roll into, similar to the Deputy Secretary, for the group CIO reports into that individual. And what we found really works is when the group CIO and the deputy CIO align on what are the biggest initiatives that are going to be tackled by the organization. Because if you don't get that alignment, it is really hard to get the lines of business to get any real alignment with what the overall objectives are. And by the way, if you want to do some best practice visits, I can name 2 or 3 folks who have done a great job being, COO to, in this case, group CIO, and then the underlying CIOs. And I've seen it work very, very effectively in 2 or 3 very large companies where what they've really done is driven alignment from that deputy secretary in your example all the way down to the lines of business. And that's where this all starts. And again, it sounds like you're trying to formalize some of this work, but we've definitely seen some real success. And I've also seen cases where it does not work. And when it does not work, it's either one of 2 things: lack of alignment on objectives, or the wrong people that don't want to be part of the bigger pie. And so in interviewing for that line of business CIO, the individual you'll find has to understand what their role is and what their connection to the larger agency is, or it will not work.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think the three of us in the room that I can see real quick, Tony, Raphael, and myself, all served in the private sector as well. So, for example, when I was CIO at Corning, we basically had a matrix organization, so that we had horizontal alignment as well as country alignment as well as organizational alignment. Works great, it's just we haven't been that successful in implementing matrix organizations from a governance standpoint in the federal government.
Yeah, and one more question on a comment you made on budgets and budget oversight. Sounds like you have veto power over projects within a budget. Do you, based on these, maybe these common baseline solutions that have been set forth, or maybe what you've already put in place in advance of this, I presume you're very involved in budget formulation at the bureau level, and meaning forward-looking as opposed to what's been approved?
Wait, the bureau or the agency level?
No, even
the
at the bureau
answer-
level. Even
yeah,
at the, he said at the bureau level,
Right.
he has veto power.
Yeah.
And so my question at the bureau level, so that's kind of backward-looking in many respects in terms
Well,
of
one
what's
of-
been approved. So what about formulation,
Okay.
budget formulation,
Yeah,
forward-looking?
I agree, and one of the positives that's coming out of the work that Tony and his office are doing that's very, very positive for Commerce, and that is that the FTARA guidelines and the baseline guidance, we are actually leveraging at Commerce. My office is leveraging along with my Assistant Secretary for Management and our other CXOs, such that it enables me for the first time to be involved at the front end of the budget formulation process. I've always been involved in a review after budgets have been formulated and established, which, as everybody in the room knows, is not the optimal time to be involved. So we think this is a very positive change that's coming out of this guidance that we can leverage very effectively inside the Department of Commerce.
So if you then back up further into the formulation of initiatives, how does so what we used to have was we had our portfolio management, the portfolio stat equivalents, but we had every quarter there was a discussion that included the lines of business leaders and the bureau heads and the CIOs together in a discussion of how we were going to allocate budgets to projects. And so the question is on a quarterly basis, and it was a really nice rhythm, which kind of leads to what Sam was saying, is there was the real discussion of what projects would get started. And it was a really high bar to start a new project if some number of projects hadn't been completed. But there was a quarterly cadence to do this portfolio review and then new initiative discussion.
As we move forward in Commerce, we're not doing what you described today, but what the Deputy Secretary and the Secretary have incorporated. We do a Department of Commerce strategic quarterly alignment of initiatives. What we're now going to incorporate is the CIO involvement and the Bureau CIOs in an extension of that quarterly process. We'll get to that over the next probably 6 months. We'll begin doing that. So we'll refine it, and our goal will be to make it part of, incorporate it into our ongoing process as we enter FY 16, FY 17.
The real important component, though, is no new initiatives until things are getting completed. Because what we found was every line of business came in with their new 6 initiatives every quarter. And I used to sit on these on a quarterly basis, and unfortunately I had to be the heavy to say, no, we're not going to do a new initiative until we finished some of these other things. Because IT would get, with Thrash, I mean, we would literally have folks scrambling from project to project, and we really had to have a very, very high bar in those quarterly reviews on what's being completed and what gets started.
So, and I apologize for all the questions. Help me with that. You talk about the veto capability you have with the Bureau. It seems to me the way the budgeting process works here, this view that we might have in the public sector that you don't start anything new until you've completed other projects wouldn't work within the budget context here because it was set forth for approval 2 or 3 years ago. It's been approved. You're now in process. Are you able to actually veto and slow down or stop projects that have been approved several years ago?
The answer is actually yes. We have this, we have, federal CIOs now have the authority. We've actually had it. Now, let me be totally candid in this discussion. I would want to kind of use that authority very, very carefully and very judiciously for precisely the reasons that you've stated. This is not something that any federal CIO would take lightly. I think that if we really felt that something were about to go totally off the tracks with regard to our area's of responsibility, then professionally, I certainly personally would feel an obligation to step forward. But it wouldn't really be a veto, a permanent veto. It would be oversight. This isn't right. We're going to work collaboratively to correct what appears to be running off the tracks.
And so for the understanding as well, as part of what's in FITARA are some of those same oversight pieces that Steve is talking about at the department down to the bureau level. Those same authorities Tony has as well, not in terms of being able to reach into a particular department and stopping something, but in terms of that oversight role and taking a look at the health of the IT initiatives that are out there. And there are mandatory pieces where if an initiative is rated low performing for a course of 3 months, then we step in to say, we really need to have some more eyes on that to be able to assist and facilitate for the agency CIOs that process.
Based on my background, I'm certainly biased, so I'll start off by saying that. But you know, from our point of view, and it doesn't matter which industry we go talk to right now, the two things people talk about that's happening is digital disruption and digital transformation. So I think my first message, and it feels like this is coming full circle because we started our work talking about IT, you know, when we first started off. I mean, the role of IT, I think my first message would be, it just has to be viewed as IT is an enabler to any innovation that you're trying to provide. And it doesn't matter which group, which bureau you are in. And unless that mental shift happens, I think with everything that's happening with mobile and cloud and social, and I know I'm preaching, Tony, to you know, the converted, that I think you're never going to solve the problem of, you know, how critical IT is to the functioning of every organization. So I think that's my first message. At Adobe, I'll share a couple of things that we've done that are hopefully useful. The first is, we used to have a traditional IT budget, and IT would be budgeting separately from the company. We've completely changed that right now. Every year we have what are the top goals of the company, and what role is IT playing to making that happen. And without that, it's not a conversation around IT having to justify a budget. It's a question of, and we have the same issues, which is we have business units and they may have different priorities relative to the corporate, you know, corporate priorities. But I think the first message is we just view IT as you're presenting as part of the business unit objectives. And so the business unit sponsor is actually recommending why the stuff that you're doing is critical to their functioning. We have a roadmap, and the roadmap today actually doesn't separate IT roadmap as it used to. Even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we used to have a separate IT roadmap with the initiatives, Enrique. Nowadays, we no longer do that. We're like, this is the corporate roadmap, and these are the IT things that are happening that are an enabler to, you know, whatever functions you do. And I think it changes the conversation. So I'd encourage you, as you think about, you know, what's happening with IT, to have that be part of the corporate priority, if you believe it's an enabler. And, you know, I think the last thing that I wrote down associated with it is, we've also changed how we think about IT in terms of running, you know, the business, keeping the lights on, as you said, Bill, versus new initiatives. And you have to have a ratio that you're prescribing, because you can't do everything. Otherwise, it'll become so easy to just say more and more and more of the IT budget is keeping the lights on. And I think you want to create a culture where people are coming in and they're feeling like they're contributing to the, you know, future of the mission, rather than, you know, being a budget exercise. So I think those are three things we've found: have a combined, you know, business unit and IT operating plan and roadmap, really change what you're doing with respect to running, you know, keeping the lights on versus new initiatives. And I think you want more with respect to new initiatives. And while I do a certain amount of corporate allocation for overall IT budgets, I actually found this has, made every business unit leader, which I think would be equivalent of a bureau, feel like they're incented to, without IT, they're not going to be successful. And I think that shift has to happen.
Yeah, and I think I'm really encouraged by what I see here on slide 21, because it feels to me like you're embracing a lot of the tenets that Shantanu just commented on. The one thing I think that I don't see, at least explicitly in here, is this, what are the kind of common objectives, what are the desired outcomes? And maybe that happens in these departmental, it sounds like that's beginning to happen at least, these quarterly strategy reviews, because having that happen and making sure that CIO or IT is an integral part of all of those discussions, back to Shantanu's points, is really, really important. But as I look at these 5 areas you've laid out, there's a lot of things you're embracing that are very common in the private sector. And I'm really encouraged by that. I'm sure there are a lot of unintended consequences of this FITARA Act that aren't so great, but there are a lot of things you seem to be embracing that I think will be really positive.
And just to follow up on the metric that Shantanu started on, so some of us talk about build, run, innovate, and you mentioned roughly 60 on 80, so that's 75%. Where people are trying to get to is run, getting it down to 60%. Historically, it's been in that 70-ish%, and the question is, how do you get it to 60? Shantanu started to talk about some of the big things that are going on that we all talk about, mobile and cloud being the two, and people do see, and a CIO friend of mine once called moving to some cloud initiatives freedom from choice, meaning that we used to struggle with this where a lot of people would customize our on-premise systems so much that it made it very expensive to maintain and run. And I know you've done a lot of work to think about how do you move to cloud-first initiatives, but people are finding that there is a real opportunity. Not only the CapEx versus OpEx discussion has proven out to say maybe there can be some benefits, but the real benefit is how much are you customizing the systems that you're bringing on. Again, high bars for customizations. And so the question really comes down to, can we get to run at 60% of the total budget so we have more dollars for innovation and for the build phase? I think that just follows on Shantanu's comments.
Hi, Stacy Rogers from SSA again. Just wanted to say that a lot of what you're saying resonates with the direction that we're heading. Bill was with us when we started this IT transformation that really, FITARA, is just the undergirding for us. And we were just so pleased that many of the pieces of the guidelines fits with the direction that we're going. But the thing that really resonates is the notion that IT spending has to be aligned with the priorities of the organization. And that's not necessarily how it often had been happening. We make IT decisions, but can you track it back to where the corporate leadership is saying this is where we have to go and what are the IT solutions that we need to get there? That was a fundamental shift in our thinking. Secondly, the notion of being able to stop and start something or be nimble enough to pivot when new things come. New things come to agencies all the time that depend on IT solutions as well. We have to have the ability to be able to adjust when new laws or pieces of the Budget Act comes that we know are tied to IT and have significant fiscal impacts for us, so that flexibility. But the other thing is we don't have in our organization the problem of central CIO and bureau CIOs because we only have one CIO, so it aligns. But where the problem rested was the transparency among the business owners and IT. And then another area where we shifted is cross-year budgeting for a project from beginning to end in the fiscal out years, because that's where we saw challenges of starting something that was approved in a fiscal year, but then you get to the next fiscal year and there are other priorities that come up, and that piece gets put on hold and it never gets finished. So this strategy, our IT transformation, is about multi-year funding for a project, building in some flexibility for unanticipated activities, how we do that, and then that constant corporate review is corporately owned. We will move toward more frequent reviews as opposed to an annual or semi-annual review. We are going to have quarterly reviews of here's what we agreed that we would invest some money in, here's how it's going, oh, here's some unanticipated things, what do we shift? And the corporate leadership table owns that work and responsibility, knowing that the undergirding for us is the IT innovation to reach the outcomes that we need to reach. And I think that's going to be transformational for our organization.
So HUD is in an unusually simpler position. So we don't have the complexity of these larger organizations like transportation, commerce, but we have our own set of problems and issues. And I'll just give you a quick anecdote. When the Deputy Secretary, I started 2 months before the Deputy Secretary started. When she came in, she asked me, do we have a problem with shadow IT at HUD? And I said, oh, absolutely. We have a very large problem. It's the Office of the CIO. They're in the shadows, allowing the program offices to run IT, to build their own solutions, point solutions, throw them over the wall and say, okay, CIO, put this into the infrastructure and make it work. And it never worked. Or it worked, but it was costing a lot of money. So there was a lot of problems with how we were managing that budget, and we were getting purely an O&M budget and not being able to innovate with it. So we immediately started to work at changing that paradigm. How do we now start taking away those contracts and that authority over IT from the program offices and start putting it into the Office of the CIO and then transforming the Office of the CIO? The problem was that now we had to change the whole structure of the Office of the CIO and the mindset and looking at how do we change the workforce to be able to support digital disruption, digital services, and moving forward. So when FITARA came along, it was like a godsend. It was perfect. It was exactly moving the agenda that we had started to work with, because we had started to work with the CPO and the CFO to change that paradigm at HUD. There was a lot of resistance. The program offices, especially housing, which is a very powerful organization within HUD, it's the H in HUD, after all, was very resistant because they were building their own systems and they thought they were doing it right, but they were not doing it. It was costing a lot of money. But we're turning the corner now. We're getting a lot of cooperation, and I think the foundation of it is that I've enjoyed the support of the Secretary, the Deputy Secretary, to say, yes, we need to rethink how we do IT. And in fact, one of the Deputy Secretary's initiatives coming out of her deep dive assessments of HUD is enterprise IT. How do we implement enterprise IT and look at IT not just from a point solution perspective, but across the budget, across the program areas, and saying, oh, so housing, you need a loan review system, and PIH, Public and Indian Housing, you need a loan review system. Why are we going to build 2 loan review systems when we can start looking at these solutions from an enterprise perspective? So we've made a lot of progress in that area. We've been able to put together communications and teams and support from across it, because part of that is how do we get folks to understand that, you know, it's not that we're trying to take over IT as much as we're trying to enable the businesses more effectively with the IT, with the limited budget that we have in IT. So it's been very helpful, very useful, and as we're moving forward, we're looking at more capabilities and more opportunities for reducing that O&M and actually taking that O&M and shifting it over to more innovative solutions.
You know, appreciate the comments, Rafael. I think you talked, Bill, about the maturity model, or how people assess. I think that maturity model is really important, because one of the things that we've all found is if you don't have, in this case, the deputy secretary highly aligned with what you're trying to do from enabling the business and how IT is going to play an integral role, I don't know how you're scoring maturity, but I think it really starts there. I mean, with the executive leadership commitment, prioritization, describing the role of what the CIOs need to get done, working with the lines of business of the bureaus. And where I've seen this fail, again, repeatedly, is where there is this notion that IT is important, as Shantanu was saying, but it's lip service. And it's not getting the discussion at the senior level. So any maturity model that doesn't include high alignment at the very top of the organization and tested for, which is how do we prioritize, what discussions do we have, it's not going to work. And
One thing that Tony has been very clear on is that we focus perhaps too much on that cost savings, and if we're not able to speak in the language of the business and help them to understand how this is really about enabling us to improve and extend upon our mission, and if we do that, we will save money, but we need to make sure that we can speak in those terms as well.
And I also think to talk about innovation, a more innovative way of delivering services as opposed to continuing to do it in a way that we may feel comfortable, i.e. going to cloud-based services as opposed to how we deliver services now. The other thing is how we develop. Our agency had a history of wanting to build everything internally and moving towards sprints. You know, we've had some challenges with how we develop things, and we've got a workforce that's very comfortable with doing it just that way. Billy can identify, but we have to help the IT workforce understand there's lots of innovative ways to do things that are more cost effective and more efficient at the end of the day, and then they begin to feel good about their contributions once they've been educated about where we're going, and that it's not about they didn't do a good job. It's just a new way of doing the work.
One interesting aspect from our life is that, and I echo a lot of the comments that others have made, is that moving towards more of an enterprise-wide view in IT has been helpful, although we did not have the Bureau problem either. We had our own particular views or issues, but one thing we have done at EPA, and this started 15 years ago, is starting to find ways to link the IT systems of ourselves and our state partners. We operate in a very decentralized and delegated legal framework with regard to states, and a group started up some 15 years ago called the Information Exchange Network, which was to try to find ways that states who were doing information collection work similar to what we did when we exercised the regulatory authority, and how to make those systems talk together better to each other. And it's been a long journey because much of our own software dated back from the 70s, and states had a whole diversity of different software approaches. It's turned out, and this speaks sort of the point that you made about how it has to be integral to the enterprise, it's turned out that this has become a foundational piece for a larger thing we're doing, which we call somewhat inelegantly e-enterprise for the environment, which is trying to find ways to modernize the whole business of environmental protection, recognizing that it is a system that involves both state and federal partners, and we need to work on our governance and streamlining across all of those different aspects. And it is exactly what you said. IT, in this case, becomes an enabler for what you want to do. And so our challenge has been to make sure people don't see e-enterprise as, quote, just, unquote, IT things. It really is about the whole business of environmental protection, and the information technology works in furthering the overall enterprise, not just as IT projects for their own benefit. And that's actually been empowering to people. I think just in the last year, we've seen kind of the lights go on in people's eyes, and pretty exciting.
I'll just touch on a couple of things that come to mind as part of the discussion. I think, as you've heard, what FITARA mainly helps address is setting up a good governance model in the agency. And our guidance specifically, although in the law it talks a lot about CIO authorities, our guidance talked a lot about the interchange and the governance model with all of the CXOs in the agency, and we've continued to emphasize that as we look at agency plans and inspect to see, is there a plan there that looks like it would work from a, you know, overall good governance perspective, both in budget formulation as well as execution. I think the other thing that I've learned coming in, and I'll defend my CIO friends here a little bit, is the appropriations and budgeting process heretofore has tended to make dollars for ongoing maintenance relatively easy, and dollars for new program development or even upgrade or replacement of infrastructure, even where it could be more efficient, relatively hard to do. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to work on in the near term is if we want to get cost savings out of the existing stuff, create a mechanism for any savings there to go to the right places, which doesn't easily exist today. But also, as we talked earlier, you know, create the right incentives to go do that work. And I see that as one of the big challenges. Step one, though, with FITARA is get transparency and visibility first. And that's the main thing that I see coming out of FITARA is, you know, especially as we get to the second and third turn of the crank, we'll start to see a lot more of the truth of what's really going on and where the money is going and how it aligns, which was pretty, you know, obtuse in a lot of cases before. And then with some help from the appropriations and budgeting side, I think we can really start to, you know, move the needle.
And if I could add to that, the other key is the workforce. We've got, for instance, at HUD, we've had 20 years of contracts that we've outsourced the infrastructure to and the development. So we have a workforce that really doesn't know how to manage an infrastructure or do development. And it's now changing their perspective to say, I don't need, they're basically folks that they can get you an iPhone or a desktop and put it in place. And I'm telling them now, I don't need that. That is commodity IT, that I'm outsourcing. I'm looking at services that now support the mission. So how can we transform that workforce to be digital, to be innovative, to understand the business, to understand exactly what the business needs and be able to have that conversation with the program offices to discuss their objectives and bring that back to the OCIO and say, here's how we're going to implement a solution. Have architects that can take these solutions and now architect the appropriate enterprise solution and not one-point solutions. And so taking that workforce transformation is probably the hardest part. And we started that about 6 months ago, and we're in the process of implementing a pretty radical change to the workforce. And there's a lot of barriers there. There probably are more barriers there than to implementing FITARA, because that is, we're talking about some very, some very difficult negotiations to go on there. But the workforce is the key to implementing FITARA and to implementing enterprise IT.
So Dave, I was going to turn it back to you. I wanted to thank again the panel and everyone for their feedback. Very helpful discussion for us. This kind of feedback is important as we move forward with implementation, so very much appreciated.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Melissa. And thanks, everybody. I think that was a very stimulating conversation. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I had an opportunity over the course of the summer to speak to each of the board members extensively about the work that had been done leading up to today's meeting, but I think as importantly, what can the board do for us going forward over the next 14 months or so? And I know I came away from those conversations with each and every member saying, I think, uniformly, we're here to help. We have, more time left to do things. And what I'd like to at least spend another few minutes on is sort of brainstorming what can we ask this board to do, either collectively or individually, to help us as we either pursue FITARA, work on benchmarking, some of the human capital areas, some of the agenda that that the board certainly has addressed over their tenure. So I'd like to open it up for just sort of brainstorming on what are the areas that you would like either the board or, more access to them as individuals. Steve?
This might have been done, and forgive me because I'm not privy to all the previous meetings, that type of thing. I'm filling in for my DepSec today. But if this hasn't been considered, this might be very helpful. An opportunity to actually maybe meet, and that meet could be in person or by video teleconference, depending on geographic location, with companies that you all believe, including your own, who might represent truly best practice in similar related areas. And in this case, what I'm really after is an opportunity to talk with the CXOs of a best practice example with our CXOs, so that we really could do two things. We could dive a little bit into any one of the individual functional areas, but at the same time, learn how have the best companies figured out how to integrate horizontally across their functional communities.
I think the other piece would be, I mentioned this earlier, TBM, Technology Business Management. I think that's one of the things that Tony's been working on with the CIO Council, but it's also part of the CFO Council that needs to be working on that. And how do we ensure that we've got the right data in the right format so that we can start to make these, implement that methodology in all of the agencies to better manage IT, to be able to identify what the services are, identify the cost of those services, and how do we improve those services. So that's one thing. The second thing I would look at is hiring. I've been here a year now, and I've heard a lot of conversations about hiring, but nothing, it seems to me nothing really gets done to improve the process. I've heard of anecdotes, like at GSA, they've got some ability to streamline the process and can get somebody in 60 days. It's an anecdote, so I don't know how accurate that is. So that's one of our key areas, as I was saying, the workforce, the transformation of the workforce. We need to get the right skill sets in here and get them, because folks are motivated. We've got a great mission. The mission at HUD is just, I think it's the best mission in federal government, ending homelessness and providing a home for every American. Doesn't get better than that. That's the American dream. How do we get folks in here to be able to support that mission and be more effective with that?
Hey, Raphael, just I know this isn't the session to give you feedback and comments. What we found organizations are doing now and doing it well, not only the process of how do you recruit the best talent, so it's a little bit of marketing, as you just said, with your mission statement to try to get candidates to be really excited. But the second thing that companies are starting to try to perfect is the onboarding process, which is beyond getting the right person in the door and making sure you've got the, some firms have gone to this concept of a bar raiser, right? Meaning that there's somebody in the interview process that tries to raise the bar on the talent that you're going to attract. But then it's really that transformation, converting that person you have decided to make an offer to really being able to contribute very effectively. And so lots of investment going into what makes somebody very successful inside of your organization and making sure that they hit the ground running so that their time to value, so to speak, inside of your organization is a lot shorter and they really understand how you do business. So this notion of onboarding is also getting a lot of attention.
I think my ask would be, I think we need help with Congress. As I mentioned, this appropriations. I know. Well, but your great voices, in your respective fields and so on. But I think we have to raise the level of awareness of the importance of information technology, and as was described, I think, eloquently earlier, it's a different thing than it once was. I've gone out and talked a lot now. I think we are facing a crisis that's bigger than Y2K. There's no December 31st, 1999. And much of the government today runs on very old, outdated technology. The people that understand it and who built it and are running it are leaving every day. We're not building capacity with those skill sets. And just to do a lift and shift of those old architectures is the wrong answer. And so, you know, moving to a more shared infrastructure, shared capability is probably a better model, one that's cloud-based. But it's going to take some significant transformation and significant re-architecting of what we have. And I think sending that message, talking about it, understanding what the parallels are in the private sector as you've gone through digitization of your enterprises and what that means for the digitization of the government is one of the most important things that business leaders can do as you interact with the government. And you know, there's varying degrees of understanding what that digitization impact is or could be. And I think, you know, if we speak, you know, from experience about what that is, it's super, super helpful.
I think related to the FITARA discussion and your question, David, FITARA is often looked at as a budget and HR sort of compliant, or not compliance, but governance process. I think as with IT as an enabler, we often leave our OCIO employees to do the change management and the process improvement within the agencies. So I think a future, I don't know if it's been covered at a PMAB previously, but sort of process improvement, change management on that. But also, you know, I think Raphael, we sort of are tackling this issue at HUD right now on like how do we sort of drive the process improvement before we start automating a process that we might actually have money for.
Well, I think it would be good to touch a little bit more on the enterprise-wide perspective that we talked about in terms of IT budgeting, you know, how you engage the business sides of the organization as well as the IT proper in the discussion of the prioritization and how they align to the goals and priorities of the organization from the corporate perspective and how you move forward. I think that would be an interesting perspective to look at private versus public.
If I could add one more, I think Tony started talking about the shared services. I think from a cybersecurity perspective, I think that's where the federal government is really lacking in appropriate skill sets, and that's where I think we can leverage shared services more effectively. Certainly on the infrastructure and even at development, we can be more responsible. But from a cybersecurity perspective, we should be able to be more effective about shared services and enabling DHS to be have more availability for the shared services that they're providing.
Okay, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. First, I would like to thank the board members, both the folks that are here in the room as well as our folks on the phone for taking the time out of their busy schedules to spend, I thought, a really great couple of hours with us. I think we accomplished the objective that we had, which was to get some insights from you around benchmarking around this major IT transformation initiative, but I think equally well as to sort of think about what can we do with you either as a board or individually over the next 14 months. So I'm going to turn it back to Brad. Do we need to do any kind of formal closeout?
For sure. So again, thank you everyone, board members, thank you for joining us. PMC members, guests, thank you for joining us. We will be in touch. I think we're shooting for our next meeting to be late winter, early spring. We will get that date out as soon as possible. Do not be surprised if some of the topics we just discussed populate that agenda, as well as some others that we have started to discuss as we do look at this final year of the current administration and how we best use that time together. So thank you again. At 11:57, we now adjourn this session of the PMAB meeting. Thank you.